Story 1: The Woman in White. There's something about driving alone at night that stirs an ancient, primal fear. The dark trees loom on either side of the road, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. Shadows seem to flicker just beyond the reach of your headlights. And in those moments, the imagination is your worst enemy. It conjures up shapes and figures, whispers and movements, all in the periphery of your vision. But sometimes, it isn't your imagination. I learned this on New Year's Eve last year. A night I'll never forget. Darren's family threw the kind of New Year's Eve parties people looked forward to all year. Their home, nestled deep in the woods outside town, was the perfect venue, isolated enough for loud music and late-night revelry, but still warm and welcoming. I'd been to their place dozens of times before, so the drive there felt routine. I left my house around 7 p.m. The cold December air nipping at my face as I loaded a small gift bag and my jacket into the car. Snow wasn't in the forecast, but the temperature had plummeted in the last few days, making the roads frost-slick and hazardous. The drive took me down a series of winding back roads, each one narrower and darker than the last. Towering trees lined either side, their dense canopies blocking out the already dim twilight. I turned on my high beams, their light carving a feeble path through the oppressive darkness. About halfway there, I noticed something ahead. At first, it was just a pale smudge in the distance, barely distinguishable from the snow-dusted trees. As I drew closer, the shape became clearer: a person. A woman. She stood at the edge of the forest, her figure illuminated in the glow of my headlights. She was tall and unnaturally still, wearing a long white gown that swayed slightly in the breeze. Her hair, dark and stringy, fell past her shoulders, partially obscuring her face. I slowed down, my heart skipping a beat. What was she doing out here, alone in the freezing cold? For a fleeting moment, I considered stopping to check on her. But something about her posture, rigid, almost statuesque, made my skin crawl. As I passed, I glanced at her face. Or at least, I tried to. Her features were indistinct, blurred as if I were looking through frosted glass. Her head tilted ever so slightly in my direction, but her gaze remained fixed on the forest behind her. I shuddered and drove on, keeping my eyes firmly on the road ahead. But curiosity, or maybe guilt, got the better of me. I glanced in the rearview mirror. She had turned. Now, she was facing the road, her head tilted again, but this time in my direction. Even from a distance, her stare felt unnerving, invasive, as if it could pierce through the layers of metal and glass separating us. I slammed the mirror upward, unwilling to look at her for another second. My palms were clammy against the steering wheel as I pressed the gas, eager to reach Darren's house and the safety of its glowing windows. Darren greeted me at the door with his usual wide grin, a drink already in hand. The house buzzed with the lively chatter of guests, the clinking of glasses, and the faint hum of festive music. Within minutes, the tension from the drive began to fade. As the hours passed, the memory of the woman on the road became little more than a strange anecdote to share over drinks. Probably just someone from one of the nearby houses. Darren said dismissively when I told him, "It's weird. Sure. But not unheard of." The clock struck midnight, and we all gathered around the TV to watch the ball drop. Cheers erupted as we welcomed the new year, glasses raised high in celebration. By the time I left, the crowd had thinned. and the once lively house had settled into a comfortable quiet. It was past 1 a.m. when I slid into the driver's seat, the cold biting at my fingers as I fumbled with the keys. The driveway was deserted, the other cars having long since departed. I was tired but not alarmed. The woods always seemed unnervingly quiet this late at night. As I retraced my route home, the familiar unease began to creep back in. The same dark trees, the same frost-covered road. And then, as if fate were mocking me, my dashboard lit up with a tire pressure warning. "Not now," I muttered, pulling over to check. I stepped out, my breath forming misty clouds in the frigid air, and aimed my phone's flashlight at the tires. All four were shredded. The cuts were deep, jagged, as though made by claws rather than a puncture. My chest tightened. This wasn't normal. This was deliberate. A sudden stillness fell over the forest. The faint rustle of branches and distant chirping of insects ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then came the sound, a twig snapping, sharp and deliberate. "I see you," a voice whispered.
It was soft, almost playful, yet it sent ice coursing through my veins. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip.
She was there. The woman in white stood just beyond the edge of the road, her gown now stained with dark streaks. Her face was clearer now, and what I saw will haunt me forever. Half of her jaw was missing, leaving a gaping maw that stretched into an unnatural grin. Yet somehow, she spoke again. "Can you see me?" I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. Her head tilted in that same unnatural way, her movements disjointed, puppet-like. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The crunch of leaves and twigs behind me told me she was following. The run back to Darren's house was a blur. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel her presence, impossibly close, as if she were brushing against the edges of my mind. When I reached the house, I banged on the door, shouting for Darren. His mother opened it, her eyes wide with alarm as she pulled me inside. "What happened?" she asked. But I couldn't form a coherent response.
"Safe behind locked doors," I finally managed to explain. Darren and his parents listened, their expressions shifting from concern to disbelief. "We'll call the police," Darren's father said firmly, though his tone betrayed doubt.
I spent the night in a guest room, but sleep didn't come easily. At 3:14 a.m., I was jolted awake by a soft tapping. It was coming from the second-story window. I froze, my heart hammering as the tapping grew louder. Then came the voice. Her voice. "I see you." By morning, she was gone. The police found no evidence of anyone outside, save for a large, rusty knife buried in the snow near the house. Gutted wildlife littered the edge of the woods, a gruesome trail leading nowhere. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. Was she real? A ghost? Something worse? All I know is that I'll never take those back roads again. Story 2, The Creepy Taxi Driver. Imagine trusting someone to take you home, only to realize they might be planning something sinister. Tonight's tale from Wolf Tells will make you think twice about your next ride. If you want more bone-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. It had been a long but enjoyable weekend. I had flown to San Diego to visit an old college friend, soaking up a few days of much-needed rest and sunshine. By the time my late-night flight touched down back home, exhaustion had settled into my bones. All I wanted was to get home, throw my bags in the corner, and collapse into bed. It was just past midnight when I made my way to the ground transportation pickup area outside the airport. The air was biting cold, a stark contrast to San Diego's balmy weather. The lot was eerily quiet, with only a handful of travelers shuffling to and from their rides. I had initially planned to call an Uber, but seeing a line of taxis waiting nearby, I decided it would be faster. A yellow minivan caught my eye. The driver, a man in his mid-40s with a graying beard and tired eyes, leaned out of the window. "Need a ride?" he called out. "Yes," I replied, dragging my carry-on behind me. "How much to my address?" $30, he said with a shrug. It seemed reasonable, and I was too tired to haggle or think twice. "Works for me," I said, opening the back door and sliding in. The interior of the taxi was worn but clean, the faint scent of air freshener mingling with an undercurrent of cigarette smoke. I placed my bag on the seat beside me, buckled my seatbelt, and leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. As we pulled away, I noticed the driver glance at me through the rearview mirror. The first time, I ignored it. The second time, it made my skin prickle.
"Long flight?" he asked casually, his eyes flicking back to the road.
"Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone polite but distant. "Where were you coming from?" "San Diego," I said. "Ah. San Diego," he mused. "Bet it's nice out there this time of year. What were you doing?" "Just visiting a friend," I replied, shifting uncomfortably. His questions seemed innocent enough, but there was something about the way he asked them, like he was fishing for something. "Visiting a friend. Huh," he said, a hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. "A pretty girl like you probably has a lot of friends." The comment felt like a slap. It was inappropriate, unnecessary, and far too personal. I forced a tight smile, hoping he'd drop it. The highway stretched out before us, empty save for a few scattered cars. I focused on the blur of streetlights flashing by, trying to tune him out. But he wasn't finished. "You live alone?" he asked, his tone casual, as if he were asking about the weather. "No," I lied instinctively. "I live with my boyfriend." "Oh. Yeah," he said, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror again. "What's his name?" My stomach tightened. Why would he ask that? My mind raced, trying to come up with a believable answer. "Jake," I said, the first name that came to mind. For a moment, the car was silent, save for the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Then he chuckled softly. "Jake. Huh. Lucky guy."
I clenched my fists in my lap, my heart pounding. Something was off. I glanced at the GPS mounted on his dashboard, but it was angled just out of view. The highway signs told me we were approaching my exit. "This is my exit," I said firmly, sitting up straighter. He didn't slow down.
"Hey. You missed it," I said louder, my voice tinged with panic. "Relax," he replied, his tone unnervingly calm. "I'll catch the next one." My pulse quickened. The next exit was several miles away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he had no intention of taking it. "Where are you going?" I demanded. "I know a shortcut," he said smoothly. "No," I snapped. "I don't want a shortcut. Turn around." His grip on the wheel tightened. But he said nothing. My mind raced, weighing my options. Jumping out of a moving car was out of the question. But I couldn't just sit there and do nothing.
Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my phone and opened the text thread with my family. I typed out a quick message, "Something's wrong." Sharing my location. My hands shook as I hit send and shared my live location with a few close contacts.
The driver's voice broke the silence. "You texting your boyfriend?" he asked. His tone laced with something that sounded like mockery. "Yes," I said without hesitation, hoping it would deter him.
"Good," he said. "He should know how lucky he is."
We approached a red light. The first we'd hit since leaving the airport. My eyes darted around, searching for an opportunity to escape. That's when I saw it, a police car parked in an empty lot just ahead.
Without thinking, I grabbed my bag, unbuckled my seatbelt, and yanked the door handle.
"What the hell are you doing?" the driver shouted, reaching for the power controls to lock the doors. I shoved the door open and bolted, the cold air biting my face as I sprinted toward the police car. The driver yelled something after me, but I didn't stop. The officer stepped out of the car, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "Mississippi, are you okay?" I pointed back at the taxi, which was already speeding away. He wouldn't let me out. I gasped. He missed my exit on purpose. I think he was going to. My voice broke, the weight of the moment catching up with me. The officer guided me into the back seat of his cruiser and radioed for backup. He assured me they'd look into it. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't find him. No receipt, no license plate, nothing to trace. When I finally got home, it was almost 2 a.m. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows. My nerves still raw. Despite my exhaustion, sleep felt impossible. At 3 a.m., the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. I froze, my heart pounding. Then it grew louder, more insistent. I crept to the peephole, my breath shallow. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man was standing on the porch, his features partially obscured by the dim light. He was dressed in a dark jacket, his posture stiff and unnatural. "Sweetheart, it's me," he called, his voice eerily calm. "Open the door." It sounded like my father's voice. But it couldn't be. My father lived 2 hours away. And I hadn't told him I was back. I backed away from the door, clutching my phone. The knocking continued, each thud reverberating through the apartment. Eventually, it stopped. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I learned from my neighbor George that someone had been peering through my windows shortly after I got home. George thought it was my father. But when I called him, he confirmed he'd been at work all night. I installed cameras and changed my locks. But the fear lingered. Was it the taxi driver? Someone he knew? Or was it an entirely different predator? I moved to a new apartment shortly after. But I never felt truly safe again. Story 3: The Flute in the Forest. Would you explore a dark forest at 3 a.m., knowing it's infamous for tragic deaths? Join us at Wolf Tells as we follow two daring explorers who encounter something far worse than they imagined. Like and subscribe for more harrowing tales. The idea had been mine. Clarissa and I had been dating for a few months, and she was still learning how far I was willing to push for a thrill. Midnight adventures, urban exploration, ghost hunts. I lived for that rush of adrenaline when fear brushed against my curiosity. When I suggested a midnight hike through Greystone Forest, she hesitated. "Isn't that the place with all the creepy stories?" she asked, scrolling through the search results on her phone. "Exactly," I said with a grin. "Come on. How many people get the chance to say they faced their fears and survived? Besides, it's just a bunch of old legends." Clarissa frowned, clearly not convinced. "What about the woman with the flute? They never found the guy who killed her, right? People say they still hear her music." "Urban legend," I assured her. "Probably some local kids trying to scare people off. You'll be fine. I'll be with you the whole time." Reluctantly, she agreed. And so we found ourselves pulling into the small dirt parking lot at the edge of Greystone Forest at 2:48 a.m. The air was colder than I'd expected. Clarissa zipped her jacket up to her chin, her flashlight already on as she scanned the tree line. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" "It's just a walk," I said, grabbing my own flashlight and locking the truck. "If it gets too creepy, we'll turn back. Deal?" She nodded hesitantly, but I could tell she was already on edge. The trailhead was narrow, framed by towering trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and our flashlights cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight.
I led the way, trying to keep the mood light. "You know, they say this forest has been haunted for decades. A lot of people went missing here back in the 1970s. Some say they ran into the wrong crowd. Others blame wild animals. But the flute story, that one's my favorite."
"Stop," Clarissa muttered, gripping my arm. "I don't want to hear it." I chuckled. Fine. No ghost stories. Just enjoy the fresh air." But even I couldn't deny the strange atmosphere of the forest. The further we walked, the quieter it became. The chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Clarissa stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" I paused, tilting my head to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. Then, faint and distant, came a single, high-pitched note. At first, I thought it was the wind, whistling through the trees. But the sound continued, growing steadier and more melodic. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably the sound of a flute. Clarissa's grip on my arm tightened. "I thought you said this place wasn't really haunted. It's probably someone messing around," I said, though the unease in my chest told a different story. A camper or something. Who camps in a forest at 3 in the morning? She had a point. The melody grew louder as we continued along the trail. It was hauntingly beautiful, each note piercing the silence like a knife. But there was something wrong about it. Something that made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like it was coming from one direction, it seemed to echo from all around us, as if the forest itself were playing. Clarissa stopped again, this time pulling me back. "I don't like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's go back. Just a little further," I urged, though I was starting to second-guess myself. "I want to see who's playing." Her eyes widened. "Why? What if it's... I don't know. Something we don't want to see? Come on. Don't you want to know what's out here?" "No," she said flatly. But I was already moving forward. The melody continued to grow louder, more complex. As if whoever, or whatever, was playing had drawn closer. The trail widened into a small clearing, bathed in pale moonlight. The air felt colder here, heavier, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The flute music stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Clarissa began muttering under her breath, a quiet prayer I couldn't quite make out. Her flashlight shook in her hands, the beam darting wildly across the clearing. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible against the dark trees. But as it moved into the moonlight, my breath caught in my throat. It was massive, hunched over like a predator stalking its prey. Its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in jagged, claw-like appendages. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was a pale, featureless void, except for 2 pinpricks of light where eyes should have been. Clarissa let out a strangled scream, and the thing bolted, disappearing into the shadows with impossible speed. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her arm. We stumbled back onto the trail, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we ran. The flute music resumed, louder and more chaotic, as if mocking our fear. My lungs burned as we sprinted through the forest, the melody chasing us like a predator. It was everywhere, surrounding us, growing so loud that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. Clarissa tripped, nearly dragging me down with her. I hauled her to her feet, the terror in her eyes mirroring my own. "We're almost there," I shouted, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The trees thinned, and the faint outline of the parking lot came into view. I fumbled with my keys as we reached the truck, my hands trembling so badly that I dropped them twice.
The music reached a deafening crescendo as we climbed inside, slamming the doors shut. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a moment, we just sat there, gasping for air, our hearts pounding in unison. The forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened.
"I told you," Clarissa said finally, her voice shaky. "I told you we shouldn't have come."
We didn't speak on the drive back, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next day, I scoured the internet for any explanation, anything that could make sense of what we'd experienced. The stories were endless, people vanishing, strange lights, sightings of creatures like the one we'd seen, and, of course, the flute.
But there was no definitive answer. No evidence. No photos. Nothing concrete.
To this day, I still hear the melody in my dreams. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear it faintly in the distance, beckoning me back to the forest.
I never drove those back roads again.
But sometimes, late at night, when I'm home alone and the world outside is silent, I swear I hear her voice. Just a whisper. Just a breath, so faint, so fleeting, that it could almost be my imagination.
Almost. And when I close my eyes, I still see her standing there in the snow, tilting her head, waiting. Tell me, if you were in my shoes that night, would you have stopped to help her? Or was she never really looking for help at all? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more chilling tales like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells. You never know what's lurking just beyond the headlights.